Welcome back. So today I wanted to revisit the TRN V90S. Last time I took a quick look at it right before that $19 sale on it, and I just wanted to get a quick impression on where it was relative to the regular V90, which everyone loved. So I put that out there, but I always meant to get around to revisiting it and see if I could address some of the issues that I had with it back then. So first, I just want to thank the AK Audio Store for sending this one out. If you go look today, it's about $41, $42 on AliExpress today. So again, thank you guys for sending that one out. Before we get into it, this is the V90S. For those who don't have it, it's got a quite nice new shell although the V90 was one of my favorite shells. So I think I actually like that one a little better, and it certainly fits better for me anyway. These are KZ Starline flipped around tips. Occasionally I take my own advice and do that. But I did, if you watch my original video, I had some fit problems with especially the right one, and the flip tips actually get around some of those issues. The cable is actually a affordable Yinyu cable, $12, somewhere in that ballpark, but copper cable, we'll talk about sort of my issues later, but copper was to sort of bring out the body and not emphasize some of the upper frequencies as much, and to address some of the treble issues. So that's why I've got this cable and not a silver cable or an SPC cable or something else that might emphasize some parts of the frequency that I didn't really particularly like. So let's talk about it. So first, burn in. So I think on my quick look at it, probably didn't burn it in quite enough. I was sort of pressed for time, in a hurry. Sale was the next day. So if you get this one in your hands, do burn it in for a while. It's for me, it was quite harsh out of the box, and it will mellow out a little bit. So do burn that in. Right after the quick look, I think I went back and looked at some head-fi messages, and some people mentioned maybe it needs some more power, some amplification. I'm not sure I agree. I think it's fine. I think it's easy to drive. I tried it with the Apple dongle. I think it's more on that relatively easy to drive side. But I will say volume control is really important for me. And I know they say that as you get older, your hearing at sort of both sides, the bass and the treble, the extremes, tends to degrade. I'm not sure, either this one hits me in the wrong spot or I have the hearing of a 15-year-old, but the upper treble is super fatiguing for me, and a lot of that is volume. I'd set this one, I think it's probably a 30 to 40% volume. I'm kind of a 65% kind of guy. I like it a little louder. This one, just not possible. It hits me right in the brain, and a lot of it's this upper treble, and we'll get to that in a minute, or we'll get to it now. So let's take a quick look at some graphs, and these actually came from Kopi Okaya over at Audio Reviews. And I think he may have been the first one to do a first impression, and it was from his first impression that I actually was interested in pursuing the V90S. So generally, if you look at the V90S versus the V90, the bass, they dropped it just a little bit, come through the midsection, and it's kind of the same, and then it just rises earlier. So this little peanut gain region right here just rises a little earlier. It's kind of more narrow and peaky. So that's one difference. And then as you come across the upper mids, the reds actually drop, or the V90S actually drops quite a bit. The old V90 stayed pretty consistent. And then you get to somewhere right around here, this 10K, would say even more, 10 to 12K peak that's only found on the V90S. And I think that's the one that hits me right in the brain. I mean, I think there's a little bit right here too. This sudden rise hits me a little bit, but most definitely that upper treble just doesn't pair with my ears all that well. And it's kind of odd because when I think about the V90S and what other reviewers have talked about, and this is the one TRN from 2020 that doesn't need any modifications. It doesn't have a hot treble or upper mids, or there's no complaints on it. But then when I actually tried the BA8, it actually wasn't bad. I mean, the biggest part that people complain about in the BA8 is this little upper mid section. So the upper mids are slightly bright. If you're used to a darker tone or not so bright, the upper mids are a little bright. But this little area, put a little piece of tape. I used micropore on the BA8. I used tape on the vent on the VX. And you're going to drop this by 2 to 3 decibels, which is going to basically put you right about the same, almost the same level as the V90S. But these two don't exist on the BA8. And so that's why I say I think those two peaks just hit me in the wrong spot on the V90S. And other people who've had some great words to say about the V90S, apparently it doesn't bother them. But for me, that upper treble is really piercing, especially at louder volumes. So I definitely kept this one quite low. So sound, still V-shaped. The bass is just a little bit less in level. It's more controlled. There's a faster decay on the bass, so it's actually a little cleaned up. It's kind of nice. The mids, I had this issue with the V90. I think they're still recessed on the V90S. Perhaps not as much, but still there. And the treble is just kind of off for me. So the bass, I'll call it higher quality, especially if you like cleaner, faster decay. If you like the V90 where the bass kind of persisted, bled more into the mids, this is the cleaned up version, the refined version, and it doesn't hang around nearly as much. It's still very dynamic. There's plenty of bass there, and it'll appear when it needs to appear, but it's going to decay off quite quickly and not hang around through the mids. So some people love that sound. Other people will prefer the kind of slower, bassier version on the V90. So just an example, Jeff Cascaro's Love Will Find a Way, that bass guitar right in the beginning, it's super tight and it decays off quite naturally. It's really nice. And then the drum hits and you get this nice satisfying thump. So I don't think, even though the level dropped off a little bit, it's still more than enough and it sounds really great. And then after the vocals start, you'll sort of realize that it's not quite the same as the V90, that there's not as much body to the vocals, especially his voice, as you will find on the V90. On the V90S, it's a little less body to it. I was hoping that my cable would get me a little bit there. It's kind of nitpicking that problem. That's not the problem. But if you're really sensitive to a lot of body, and especially male vocals, you'll find it there. So the mids, you're either distant and recessed, or like Jeff Cascaro's voice, or at the upper end, you're nasal and thin. I don't know where the Goldilocks point is, where it sounds right. It was sort of one or the other for me. It's really difficult. And then when you throw in the treble problems, it's even more difficult to find that right spot where everything felt comfortable and good. But I will say that I'll still prefer the male vocals to be slightly recessed over something like Little Mix with these higher end female vocals and the S's and the sibilants and kind of brutal. And I don't know why, particularly on this one, it's probably those peaks, but I sort of found myself cringing on every S, and there's a lot of S's in that first line of that song. So tough one for me on the mids. But even Diana Krall, her song Body and Soul, it just lost a lot of that intimacy that I found on even a Blonde BL01. The V90 itself was a little bit recessed for me, so it never really had the intimacy of even the ZSX or the Blonde BL03. And I know some people prefer that more natural, slightly back sound. And so again, if you liked it on the V90, you'll probably like it again. I just would have preferred, especially a recording like that where it's so close and so intimate, you really like to hear every single detail in her voice. And not quite there for me, but again, if you prefer it on the V90, you'll like it again on the V90S. So like I said, the treble is just off for me. Cymbals are really off. They're super metallic. And one of the things that's really odd about it is this upper mid it sort of hung around a little lower. It's kind of hard to see it. It's really hard to see when here, but in other graphs, you'll see that the upper mids actually stayed recessed a little longer than the V90, and part of that was to avoid this metallic balance armature sound. So push it back a little bit so it's not quite as metallic, and I think that was the thought. And through the upper mids, that's probably true. And then when you get to those two peaks at the treble side, you know, it's sort of, for me, it just stomps over any corrections and benefits that they did earlier on in the tuning. That's all I hear is this bright treble, and that's the upper treble. So for me, like Blink 182's, all the small things, the guitars sound great. The cymbals sound a little crazy. Underworld Scribble had the same problem. This electronic beats, a lot of it just sounds like that peak all the way at like 12K. It's like you've tweaked the slider just a little bit too much on your EQ. You know, you just wish you could pull it back down so the sounds out solid again. It just sounds like a weird artifact to me. And electronic music, cymbals, it was hard to find something that sounded reasonable that included those kind of instruments. So Soundstage, I think it's similar to the V90. I know other people have said it's bigger and wider and taller. That wasn't my first opinion of it. My first opinion was I wish it sounded more like the VX or even the BA8. And I really liked TRN's modern Soundstage on those two. It's very much a wraparound, close-in Soundstage. Not so much depth, and it didn't even have a whole lot of height to it. But there was just a very nice continuous, almost circle of sound around you. It was quite nice. And the V90 is a little more, or the V90S is a little more like the V90 in that it's sort of in front of you, and it has some pretty nice width to it, and there's a lot of nice separation to it. But then instead of being continuous from ear to ear, it'll stick to one of your ears. Certain instruments will stick there, and then you'll almost feel like there's a gap between where the next instrument is supposed to be. So you sort of lose the illusion of this continuous soundstage as it's snapping to your ears, and that's, I guess, probably one of my personal beefs with it, but other people seem to be fine with it. And again, that one could be an amp thing. I think amps change, especially on the Blonde BL01. I had the same issue where it just sounded better amped, and it's possible. I've tried it on my Q Deluxe anyway. That's how I listen primarily to the V90S, and I just couldn't get it. I had a just general problem of getting this one to feel comfortable and enjoyable. Everything just sort of irritated me in slight ways. So I think the pieces of it are pretty good and right, but as a whole, it didn't quite click for me. So again, thank you guys for tuning in, and I will see you next time.